everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is, and wherever in the world you may be. My name is Matt Wynn, your podcast host and resident secure identities nerd. Welcome to another episode of HID Connects. Now, here at HID, we know a thing or two about access control, and we understand the important role it plays in a layered security approach. Sometimes, though, access control can be, an afterthought. Throw some readers on the wall, issue some credentials, and set it and forget it for maybe a decade. But with such a vast number of technologies, both old and new, being utilized in the field, how can security teams enhance their access control systems to better secure their facilities and, more importantly, protect the people and assets inside of them? Well, folks, as with any tool, it really just comes down to how it's utilized. In other words, best practices matter. So, in the spirit of sharing some of these tips, tricks, and insights, as well as seeing the bigger picture of access control within security, I'm excited to be joined by two very smart engineers, or engine nerds, as I like to call them, to share their perspectives. First, joining us virtually all the way from South Africa is Johan Oosthuizen, Senior Director of System Architecture and Product Security at HID. Welcome, Johan. Thanks for joining us so late in your evening. So introduce yourself. Tell our listeners a little bit about your experience in the access control world and what do you do here at HID?
Thank you, Matt. Obviously very welcome and happy to be here with you guys. My background has always been access control. I kind of stepped out of engineering school and went straight into a software engineering role at a small startup here in South Africa that did full stack access control solutions. And over time, it's become a very interesting passion of mine, especially when you look at all the security aspects associated with it as well. So over the last couple of years, I've moved across to HID, joined Steve's team, and I head up the architecture side of things and also look after cybersecurity.
Very cool. And Johan, last time I saw you, you said to me, and I quote, "I can be anywhere in the world and point in the direction of the nearest beach." What does that mean?
Well, it just means like when I come to Austin, Everest room, and if you look across the road to that building there, the A points you directly to Los Angeles Beach. And if you turn around slightly and you look towards the other building with the J, that's Houston Beach. It's just a skill that I've developed over the years. I need to know where the oceans are and the beaches are. We live on the coast here in Durban in South Africa, and it's just something that's ingrained in us.
As someone who is very directionally challenged, I find that fascinating. So congratulations for that. And if we ever get lost, I will come to you. So thank you for joining us. Now, also joining me here in the studio and to add even more wisdom is HID's very own Steve Belt, VP of Engineering for our Physical Access Control Solutions. So Steve, thank you for joining us as well. Same question. Tell us about yourself and what do you do here?
Okay. Well, I'm excited to be here first. So this is actually my first podcast, so go easy on me. So I've actually been with PAX now for about, in HID, for about 5 years. But I've been in engineering and product development for, let's just say a very long time. And I've spent time in semiconductor companies and system companies like Dell and others. And as I said, came here about 5 years ago. And I find the PAX industry quite interesting. Of course, I've been a user for basically my whole working career. I've always worked in large companies and we've always carried cards and there's always been readers. So now it's kind of fun actually. And I was kind of excited about joining because I had a lot of thoughts about how things could work and I got to come in and learn it and be part of it. And then of course, like Johan, I get involved with every aspect of things, including in this case, some of the cybersecurity aspects and how to help our customers frankly, think about how to deploy and create a secure environment for their facility. So I just find this stuff exciting. But honestly, I'm a nerd at heart. I really am. So all this kind of stuff excites me.
Engine nerd. And speaking of engine nerding and tinkering, so when you're not playing with products, you are tinkering with some pretty awesome cars. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I have some interesting hobbies, but one of them is I like to build and heavily modify old cars and turn them into hot rods. And a lot of it is not because I necessarily know how to do it. A lot of it I figure out as I go, and there's a lot of break fix that happens as you do that. But it's fun because, again, I get to learn things, and I dive into things that I didn't think I could do, and putting big superchargers on old 1970 era cars or things like that, sticking a gigantic transmission in a place that it never is supposed to be in a car, and finding ways to make it happen. So,
very nice.
Fun stuff.
I've got a 2013 Honda Accord in the parking lot. If you want to do anything with that, I'll give it up to your discretion. But I digress. All right. Well, y'all, thank you very much for joining. Okay. So listeners, you know our guests. So now let's dive into this episode's burning question. Safeguarding access control systems. What can you do better? All right. So Johan, I'll start with you. Access control, we all know this, has evolved greatly over the years. So let's lay a foundation. From a basic standpoint, can you describe some of the core PACS technologies in the field and some of their differences?
Yeah, that's a good starting point. I think over the years, and this goes back quite a significant number of decades now, you've pretty much had a consistent set of components within any PACS topology. You have your credentials, you have your readers, you have your I/O modules, and you have controllers or some form of software that handles the decision-making process. And if you zone in on each one of those components, you can see that technologies like credentials have evolved over the years from magstrip, which is in the 80s, to having contact-list and contact-based implementations. And your readers and your controllers followed suit. You have readers that have evolved to support those lower-level credential technologies. And today we have an exciting mix of all these different things that people can really choose from. There's a variety of different form factors and options that you can choose for any PACS deployment. And with that, obviously, comes additional risk and additional things that you need to consider, and also things that we'll probably touch on later on this topic. So I think the main message I have is that the topology is pretty much the same. It's the individual technologies within each component that seems to be evolving at a rapid rate.
Steve, I see you nodding. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think the evolving part is kind of the key to the discussion, right? I mean, there's some technologies that are still in use today that are, 25 years old, I guess, and still in use and somewhat popular even. And we're going to get into this as Johan mentioned, but this is a space where it really does depend on the customer's needs and goals for what they've implemented at their site. And there are some customers out there that frankly can use that 25-year-old technology just fine. But there are customers out there that, I think probably are either need to or are in the process of reviewing constantly their implementations, and they need to probably be on some of the newer technologies, and that's a constant evolving thing, which is interesting because the space isn't actually that dynamically changed. I mean, a lot of customers, they put the technology out there and then it stays because it works. But in many customers, that's probably just fine. Other customers, though, in users, they probably need to look at that and decide, is it still working as good as we want it to? And is it still as secure as maybe 10, 15 years ago when we put it in? Right. So there's a lot of evolution in the technology. And then sometimes I think that customers need to determine how much they want to evolve.
Okay, well, that's a perfect segue into the next topic, and that is, and Steve, I'll stay with you, knowing that evolution has transpired. I mean, you can literally see it in the design of a reader and how credentials function and all of that. But what is the holdup? Why are people staying with legacy technologies? And what do you think is holding up a potential adoption curve into more modern technologies?
Yeah, great question. And we definitely see that. And I think it goes back to a little bit of what I was saying. I mean, there are some customers that frankly, they have their goals are basically, I just don't want anybody on the street to walk into my lobby and walk into my building. But short of that, they're kind of okay with the solution. So as long as it serves that particular purpose right there, they're probably okay with it. So using an older technology like a prox card and an appropriate associated reader probably works for them. And they may not need much more. Now, I think in many cases they may not be completely clear on the limitations of that technology and how much it's changed over time. Not sure, but maybe they are, and maybe they're like, you know what, it's good enough for me. Then you have other customers like, man, I not only do I not want just the most limited ability possible to keep someone from coming in that shouldn't come in, I want to make sure I know exactly who's coming in, and I want to make sure that when that person comes through the door, it's only them and nobody's coming in behind them. And oh, by the way, I want to make sure that someone isn't borrowing their card to get in the door, and a number of other things, because for them, getting through that, whether it's an exterior door or more importantly, an interior door into a very secured area, it becomes incredibly important to them. And so I think it really does boil down to what the customer really sees as their need.
Interesting. Johan, is there a sense of, well, what we've got is good enough?
I was actually listening to what Steve was saying then, thinking to myself of a good analogy. You know, we've always had this mantra within the company that HOD is a popular brand because it just works. And that is kind of speaking to the reason why things stick around as long as they do. If you compare fire systems, alarm systems, CCTV surveillance systems, they all kind of more or less have the same functionality as they've had over the last couple of decades. And the same is true for access control. If you have something that in your daily usage of it, it performs exactly the function that you want it to do. And in our case, it's opening a door. If it continues to open the door, why change it? But there are other people that might want to look at it and go, you know, the folks that are managing these systems, if they had this small upgrade or if they adopted this small new technology, it greatly enhances their capabilities to monitor and use these systems. So it depends on who's calling or who's using the technology the most, and that drives the adoption of new technology. If you consider in the banking industry, from magstrip payment cards, how long that's been around, then we had chip cards, and now we have contactless on our phones. We just need that ideal use case that drives the adoption and but encourages people to move to the right technology for the right capabilities and the right reasons. And there are a lot of merits in some of the newest stuff that we've launched that you can clearly see there's benefit from a business operational perspective as well. So it just takes that movement, so that momentum to grow, and then you finally see this massive uptake of a new technology.
Well, and Johan, you kind of touched on this earlier in that there's the ability for new credentials to work with older readers and things of that nature just to help with interoperability and to make the lift easier for those who are looking to migrate into new solutions. But with that, there has been recent chatter in security forums and publications about, quote, downgrade attacks. So Johan, I'll start with you. Define this for our audience. What is a downgrade attack and how do they work? And Steve, I'd like for you to jump in this too.
A downgrade attack in its basic premise is essentially taking something that is a later and greater version of a technology, or more specifically a workflow or a capability, and then downgrading it to a previously known version that exists purely for the reasons of migration. And there are many use cases out in the field. If you consider some email security clients last year that had this ability to downgrade the initial authentication handshake to an older version, and thus allowing a simple way of authenticating that email client. And similar things exist in our industry as well. We have some older legacy technology, which essentially still is only spitting out a number. It's only consuming some kind of number or some form of identifier. And if you can extract that identifier from a higher security credential, for example, and put that onto a legacy credential, the output is going to be the same. And that's the basic premise of a downgrade attack. If you have some legacy form enabled or capability enabled in any of your implementations, whether it's a component like a reader or an email client for that matter, or even a phone, those legacy things tend to be there for a short period of time, and you shouldn't expect them to be there for an extended period. You should always have a cutoff date where you say, we're going to do this for the next 12 months and give ourselves the time to go and upgrade to all the newer technology and make sure that we are up to date and that we're not exposed to the stuff that many people have found many years ago. That's my view, at least.
Steve?
Yeah, I think Johan's right on. I think there's another thing that kind of plays in. We sell readers configured in a lot of different ways. There's a reader that, I think it's kind of generally referred to as a migration reader, and this is kind of where Johan was going. And a migration reader has a purpose, and its purpose is if I'm on an older technology, but I want to migrate my users up to a newer, more secure technology, then I'm going to install these migration readers, which means I can still read those older credentials, but as I migrate my users to those newer, more secure credentials, of course, it accepts those too. And then exactly to Johan's point, at the end of that migration period, you really need to go in and turn off the old credentials and only be accepting those new credentials. So that's what a migration reader is for. So there's a couple of things that happen here that kind of, I think, exacerbate that downgrade attack scenario. Number one, it's not always a best practice followed when the migration is done, those things get turned off. Those older credentials get turned off. They kind of get left on. And we see that quite a lot, actually. And that is kind of what opens the door, so to speak, for that problem. Now, the other thing that happens is our there are a number of integrators and such out there that purchase inventory of our readers to be able to deploy to all kinds of different accounts and scenarios. So for them, it's very smart. Actually, I completely get why they do this. They buy migration readers as kind of a standard on the shelf reader because they kind of do everything, right? They can accept kind of any credential. And then when they deploy them, again, the thing that should be done is they go in and depending on how they're deployed, if it is a more secure credential type and those older legacy credentials are not really intended to be accepted, then what should be done, best practice would be turn off those. That also doesn't always happen. And so you get a lot of this where, frankly, the legacy credentials get left turned on. And that is a bit of what enables this to happen. So if there's one thing that I'm sure Johan and I would agree on this, if there's one thing that we would strongly recommend people doing is whether it's as you install your new readers or you've got readers already installed, go around and make sure all the legacy credentials are turned off if you're not using them.
Psychological question. What is preventing people from doing this? Do people not know about this? Is it not a priority? Do they not have the time for it? I mean, what is the psychological driver behind some of these issues that you see? Johan, I mean, put you on the spot. What do you think?
Hey, I think it's a case of people tend to be comfortable with what they know and what they're happy with. And if, like I said, if it just works, every day you come to work, it opens the door. There's no reason for you to really go and look into this and analyze what I want to do different. And that kind of, maybe that's fun if you're protecting a garden shed at the bottom of your garden and you know that you're going to have to walk past 5 dogs before you even get to the garden shed. You don't have to worry about the LF Prox implementation that I have down there. I'm less worried about the old rusty chainsaw that I have there than I am about people walking through the front door, right? So at my front door, I might put a biometric reader if I feel that's really required. But even in my scenario, I wouldn't even put a biometric reader. A simple CIOS card would suffice. So it's all about understanding your risk profile, understanding what you deem to be your necessary attack vectors, and then based on that, you make an educated decision. And your educated decision is based on the likelihood of something going wrong.
That gave me a visual of a dog trying to execute a downgrade attack, which is funny in and of itself. So there's that. So let's segue and let's dive into some of the best practices. And we outlined here is how the ecosystem works within an access control system. So we'll kind of go component by component. So Steve, I'll start with you. What can users do to enhance security from a reader perspective?
Sure. Well, we hit on probably one already of the most important points, which is I guess I'm going to bleed over into credentials at the same time as I do this. But if you're someone who believes, let me back up a little bit because he went down a path a second ago. I think it's important to get this out.
Please do.
Which is access control and your strategy around access control cannot simply be what reader is on the wall and what credential I have. It's far more than that. And again, it really does first start with what the building administrator and the company wants to do with their facilities, but the reader on the wall that lets you through the exterior door is one step in that. I mean, there are a number of things that make up that entire multi-layered strategy around managing access. I mean, number one, you may or may not want to have surveillance on every one of these doors, so you kind of have a way to keep track of what's happening at those doors. There's a number of reasons for that you could probably figure out. Of course, there's the readers at the door. And then you might want to consider, well, if I'm really worried about security, is a single form of authentication good enough? Should it be multi-factor? So today it's super easy just to replace your standard reader with a keypad reader and then say, well, not only do you tap your card, but type in your code. And that code would be probably unique to that person. So on top of the fact that we have now doubly confirmed that this person is known to us, and by the way, that they can come in this door, that because that is something you have, which is a card potentially, and something you know, which is that code, we're pretty sure it's actually that person using that card. And then, depending on if these are, again, exterior doors, not everybody does this, but a lot of times those main access areas have someone monitoring the door. There's someone either physically there, standing in the lobby, or like I said, maybe doing so through a camera. So my point is you got to decide what your entire access strategy is going to look like. And then, based on what that bigger picture looks like, then you can get into what the components need to be set up for and which ones you choose. So now back to the reader. So in the reader, of course, my suggestion would be right off the bat, go to the most secure credentials, which for us would be a CIOS type credential, and ensure that your reader associated with that CIOS credential is only enabled to allow those CIOS credentials. So the thing we talked about before with the downgrade attacks, not a concern, right? And then also, if possible, I would again suggest that maybe you consider readers multi-factor, again, depending on where you are in that layered strategy. Now, I'm going to bleed over into credentials, so pardon me for doing that. But I think there's another thing that needs to be done here, and we're going to open up a whole new topic here in a moment with my next comment, which is really how we manage the cryptography that is used to authenticate the credential to the reader. And that is based on some keys. So let's just use the generic word key, like a lock almost. So with that key, we at HID support 3 types of, if you want to call it key types, customer kinds of keys. We have something called standard keys, which in that case, if you're a standard key customer, your keys that allow your credentials to be authenticated are shared among a large pool of people, but they're obviously intended to be secure and safe and all that, but it is basically one key. We manage the key for everybody, so customers don't have to worry about any of that kind of stuff. We deal with all of it. But if you're a customer who, again, in that strategy, you're kind of a step further up there, you want to say, all right, well, okay, I understand you're going to keep the standard keys secure and all that, but I would really like to have my own key. Then we have something called elite key. Elite key means only you as the customer have this key. Nobody else shares this key with you. So you have a kind of one step better ability to manage your own security because you're guaranteed that nobody else knows this key except you and, well, nobody knows the key anyway, but nobody has the key other than you. And then there's custom keys, and custom keys goes a step further and says, well, those keys, we don't even know. It is totally owned by the customer. We don't touch it. We never see it. They create it. They use it. And that's for probably those folks who have the most concern about managing the keys. Now, why is that important? Because when you set up a credential, you have to have that key in there so it can authenticate to the reader. So for me, for most customers, I would suggest people move to elite key or have elite key because that gives you in my opinion, the most secure approach that you can have while we still do a big bunch of the work for you. So you don't have to worry about it. Custom is, again, a little further down the road, but that puts some more onus on the customer. In this case, elite is the right answer. So you get Signo readers, you get elite key status, elite key credentials, and you use CIOS credentials, you turn off the legacy stuff, and I think you got a pretty good start at the door. And then multi-factor if you want to add that as well.
Very nice. Johan, anything you want to add, supplement?
First thing, stop using Wiegand. That's probably the first thing I want to say. Please, for the love of... I mean, it's such an old technology, and it's been around for many, many years. And for whatever reason, we still see it pretty much everywhere. There are a lot of places where you would still find it. And it used to be the lowest common denominator for reader type installations or for communications, really. Open supervised device protocols intended to be at least a standard that sets you apart, right? And says that, look, let's all try and at least use this communications method. It's bidirectional. It gives you the ability to manage your readers and configure them. And you can do lots of exciting capabilities once you have that bidirectional communication. So the very first thing off the top of my head, Steve's points are great. But from my point of view, I'd really like the industry to start migrating away from Wiegand as a communications technology. There are other small things that you can do as well. Your anti-tamper alarms that you enable on the reader, those are your first indicators that something's wrong. Yep. And you can do a much better job of those type of alarms if you have bidirectional communications. Labeling your readers. If you think about electrical wall sockets or network points, they all have numbers associated with them. If you find an aesthetically pleasing way to label your readers, it makes pinpointing problem areas much easier. Users of the products every day can then say, it's not just that reader down in the lobby where you have 50 of these things. You can say it's reader number 0051. It's the exact one that's on that particular turnstile that's flashing red for some reason. And that gives your monitoring company or your own security staff the ability to respond a lot quicker to incidents or to things that might be of concern. From an installation maintenance point of view as well, just a simple thing like having a labeled reader allows you to do quicker maintenance, quicker response times, etc. Spoken about disabling things that you're not using. Legacy credentials is a good example, but there might be other items in your device or capabilities in your devices that you should turn off. If you're not using it, from a security point of view, just disable it, turn it off. That's one of the first things that you can do. You do it on your mobile device, you do it on your electronics at home. If you're not using something, turn it off. That's a very good way of securing a product just from the get-go. And I guess that's just the basics from a reader point of view. That would certainly enhance what you can do with monitoring, meaning how you perceive threats or how you perceive problem areas. Maybe the reader's in some upgrade mode or somebody's been fiddling on the BLE interface. If you want to turn off BLE, that's fine. You can still manage it via NFC. That forces you to be at the device at a lower distance. And it also allows you to thus keep a closer tab on who's got access to what.
Very nice. Let's talk credentials, but I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction. And of course, we talk about migrating from legacy technologies into newer ones. And of course, that could be from a Prox credential to a CIOS credential. But there's also this new notion or semi-new notion of mobile credentials. Mm-hmm. Where does mobile credentials fit into security best practices in access control systems? Steve, I'll start with you.
Okay. Where do they fit from a security perspective? The way, I don't want to get too deep into this because frankly, it'll get too geeky pretty fast. But the way we've architected mobile credentials, they are already, I don't know if anybody knows this, and I'm going to go out on a limb because I just totally believe this is a true statement and people should know it. Our mobile credentials are already a step up in security over physical credentials. So if mobile brings a lot of value from a user experience and just overall ease of use. Everybody loves their phones nowadays, and it's just so natural. I admit I haven't used my badge, and I can't remember the last time I used my badge. But on top of that ease of use thing, it's also more secure. And I'm not saying, and of course I would never say that our physical credentials are not secure. They really are, and like I spoke about a lot of the issues there in CIOS and all that. But one step above that is mobile credentials, because in essence, we've taken some of the learnings that I spoke about earlier, and when we developed the mobile credential approach, that was all built in from the beginning. So honestly, if you're ever considering mobile credentials, but you thought, I'm not really sure why. It's a nice user experience thing, but I don't know if we really want to do that. I don't know if whatever. Do it for the security reasons. It's more secure. So that's how I would view it. I mean, I can get into the why, but I don't know if we really want to get in there. Johan, do you have?
I think one of the good reasons or best reasons you can give, Steve, is just the management aspect of a mobile or a virtual credential, if you will, versus a plastic card. It's much harder to recover and revoke access rights from a physical card than it would be from a mobile card. Right? So your virtual credential is always online. Yeah. You have the ability to do a lot more. You can even do upgrades to your mobile credential. You can literally change the performance of the credential. You can add security, you can remove security. There's a lot more flexibility in mobile credentials. And just playing devil's advocate, mobile credentials maybe aren't moving at the rate of adoption as it should be. And there are other various reasons for it. If you think about the difference between a wallet in your pocket that contains a set of plastic credentials versus a wallet on your device that has all these other capabilities, and where that device is taken into. There are sites where you can't take in a mobile phone for the risk of the camera, not the mobile credential that's on it, but purely because it has a camera and a microphone. And those would be risky items to have in a data center, for example, or in an oil refinery where wireless interference could become a real issue. So there are scenarios where the mobile device itself is the problem, not necessarily the credential. And there's got to be a balance somewhere. There's got to be a fact. I've taken many examples myself where every time I walk out of a hotel room, where's my card? Where's my card? Whereas I never have to worry about where my phone is. I know my phone is in my pocket always. And that's a good use case for convenience over losing that card or not having it available at the right time.
Well, and shameless plug for HID Connects, we've got an entire episode in Season 3 about this very topic, so make sure that we check that out as well. Let's move to controllers. Johan, do you want to start? Best practices for controllers.
Right, so controllers are somewhat They're definitely better secured. If you take from where these things are installed in a typical building, they're usually in an unreachable place.
Yeah.
So you kind of already have a good layer of security around a controller implementation. But on the other hand, controllers often are on the network. They connected on some form of IP. And that's where things get a bit more complex. There are very, very many layers of security that you can implement on an Ethernet, on a network layer. Generally, with controllers, you've got IP capabilities, so maybe you want to lock it down to a specific VLAN. Put your infrastructure on a specific VLAN. Ensure that your routing is correctly set up. Your IP addresses are correctly set up. Your MAC address binding, even if you want to go to that extreme, make sure that from a network and a physical layer, or networking layer at least, you have locked down that particular type of infrastructure. Secondly, coming back to the same thing as with the readers, disable what you aren't using on that controller. If there's a web interface that allows you to do this or that, it's supposed to be a short-term thing. Typically, controllers are managed by the PAX head-end system. There's no good reason to leave the web interface enabled or some other form of interface, a USB port or a third-party SD card that you can maybe plug in for a backup purpose or something like that. If you aren't using these things, disable it. That's a simple best practice that I certainly would recommend. It's stuff that you don't need day to day, really. If you're not using them at all and you're managing the entirety of that controller through a PAX head-end system, rather do that. Controllers, another good important thing about them, they come with a lot of I/O. They are the very things that enable you to monitor downstream signals. Tamper signals, alarm signals, offline status, etc. Why not use those? So make sure that your wiring topology caters for that. Make use of the controller's full performance and power to make sure that you can monitor your entire solution from a central point. Some sites might have failover controllers where they just have two sets of everything in the same box. That might be another way, but it's not necessarily a security thing. It's more of a, how do I keep my system from monitoring all my downstream devices that are exposed in an exposed area? So controllers, less worried about physical access, but certainly remote access, you do want to lock down as much as you can. And if you do have remote access enabled on these things, always ensure you have proper authorization and authentication controls. And there are many different flavors of that. You get certificate-based, you get username password-based, you can even tie it into your Active Directory if you like. So essentially treat it as a normal IoT device and make it locked down.
Steve, I see you like nodding emphatically, like you're, at a sermon and you're just really into it. So what else do you have to offer onto that?
Well, Johan hit a lot of the right points there. If anything, I might almost double down on a couple comments.
Sure.
Because I'm not sure he missed anything. He touched on this earlier, but, and this is the controller side of the discussion, just make sure you're using OSDP. Stay away from weekend. There's a lot of good reasons for that. Security being a very big one, but also, let me just call it future proofing. I mean, there's a lot of things that we'll be doing, over time that will leverage OSDP for a lot of new capabilities. So any new installs should be considering OSDP. And if you're considering any changes to your current install and you're wondering if you should invest in the conversion to OSDP, I would strongly recommend that. So that's kind of first. Again, as he said, the controllers themselves, not too worried about access to them, so it's not a physical access thing. Mm-hmm. But because, and again, it's a doubling down on his comment, because a lot of the tamper information goes from the reader through the controller back into your PAX software, ensure that's all enabled. What we do see now and then is, even though our readers have a couple different ways to determine, tamper, it's not enabled. It isn't enabled at the reader. It's not enabled through the controller, and it's not monitored at the head end or at the PAX software. So make sure that's enabled. And there are a lot of reasons for that, other than just good hygiene. So that's nice. About all I would add. I think he covered everything.
Very good. I mean, it's a little bit of spring cleaning aspect to it, right? If you're not using the credentials, make sure you turn it off on the readers. Make sure you're doing this. And there's a lot to consider, but a lot of common sense involved as well. I'm going to ask a question that's a little bit outside of the scope of best practices, but it's related. And that is, what does the future hold in helping to enable end users and partners to get to this state? How do we make it easier for them? And what does that mean in terms of a technology, or not a product roadmap question, because I know I'm talking to engineers, but just generally speaking, where is the industry going and how do we make this better and easier for folks? Johan, I'll start with you.
Matt, there's an interesting accelerated adoption of cloud-based connectivity. I do find it interesting. If you take only 5 years ago, there weren't many players that offered cloud-based access control solutions. All the usual fears about having data pushed up to a cloud environment, etc. But I certainly think that connectivity is a very, very important aspect. And what Steve was alluding to earlier, OSDP is a vehicle for enabling capabilities. Once you have bidirectional comms throughout your entire components, all your different topologies have a means of communicating with each other, that allows you to do a lot of good things. We are working on a number of exciting projects that will certainly make management of typical PAC solutions a lot easier. It will introduce capabilities that we don't have in the field or in the market even today. But just having that connectivity is the vehicle that carries it. There are many different technologies that we can even add onto our current platforms to expand on that connectivity. And that also, again, introduces more and more exciting capabilities. If you consider at a typical door, you would have a PIR sensor, maybe for your alarm system. You may have a camera. You may have this wireless reader at the door. You might have an IP reader at the door. You might have still your traditional access control reader at the door. But why aren't these things all talking to each other at the same time? Why can't I get different inputs from different components that maybe aren't part of the same solution, but because they have a connectivity that is common, I now have the ability to combine them all and enrich the data that I get from that door. I can add another layer of multi-factor if I choose. I can combine multiple data points from that single entry to now include a different threat model. And that's maybe something we haven't spoken about yet, but there are different, this is the exciting part for me. The more I see connectivity increasing in the field and in this industry, the more capabilities it unlocks. And that is what I think will enable that niche thing that just accelerates things like mobile adoption. You suddenly see a spike because now we've created all these great use cases that enable all these great capabilities.
More knowledge, more value. Makes sense. Steve?
Yeah. Great points, Johan. So above and beyond kind of the fusion of the data that he was talking about there, this is also another reason, by the way. I know we keep hitting on this OSDP thing, but another reason to be using OSDP is because there is a number of different types of telemetry data that we'll be able to pull from a reader. And once all of those things once all the readers are connected, that telemetry data can be used for a lot of things. To Johan's point, it can be used for kind of a fusion approach of gathering not just individual pieces of data, but what does all that mean to us, right? You can start to probably guess that, whether if I have a PIR or a camera or just the reader or whatever other kind of sensors I might have there, I can gather all kinds of data from the reader itself. I can gather that kind of data. I can fuse it. But things like, I don't want to get too deep into this, but imagine a world where that we know, I'm trying to be careful what I say here, but I don't want to go too crazy. But imagine a world where now you start to bring a little bit of kind of an AI concept almost into this discussion. So we know like who's going through, well, this is going to sound bad when I say it, that's why I'm trying to be careful. But let's say that it becomes known, that certain users are using certain doors at certain times. You can actually pick up trends from that, and it becomes almost another way to validate, all right, well, we've seen this a lot, so that's probably another thing that raises our confidence that this is a legitimate access, right? If we see somebody going through a door they've never been through before, we want to probably be extra sure that this makes sense to us. But as you start to gather all this new data, then you can bring new concepts to increasing security at the door through whether you want to call it AI or whatever you want. But there's new ways to look at the information, which again is why being able to pull all that information back so it can be leveraged is important.
Very good. Perhaps a topic for season 7 or 8, depending on how fast we get there. That's awesome. All right, so let's bring things back to the present, my friends, and that's really kind of a summary question. So if you were to summarize or offer your key core pieces of advice / best practices in fortifying an access control system, let's summarize and answer today's burning question. And Johan, since it's later for you, we'll start with you. When it comes to safeguarding access control systems, what can our listeners do better?
Matt, one thing we haven't really delved into in this conversation yet is threat modeling. I think threat modeling is it's actually an easy exercise if you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, but it's an important one. If you really sit, and this speaks to the analogies that we were using earlier about the garden shed and all these different scenarios, those are examples of threat modeling, where you sit and you think about, what is my risk for somebody getting through the front door or the front gate? Or what is my risk associated with somebody walking into my lobby where I have 50 turnstiles and one of those readers goes offline or the controller is offline at that moment? You kind of work through scenarios as a group and you get input from all your different stakeholders in your company, whether it's your security personnel, even your CEO will have a good contribution. He might say, this actually happened to me in a past life where a previous boss wasn't happy about the time it took him to get into his parking garage. And I offered him a simple solution. Instead of having to put your arm out and present it to this, I'll give you a fob that you can push a button on as you drive in. But you don't consider the necessary risk associated with that, but it's an example of where you consider all the different scenarios that you might have in a typical PAC solution, and then consider what if scenarios. What if this went wrong? What if that went wrong? How am I going to cope with that? Is that a measurable risk? Is that something I'm okay with? Do I expect so-and-so to arrive at my door at this time? And would I expect my alarm to take care of that? Or would I expect my surveillance to take care of that? Or should my PAC solution take care of that? You go through your entire security solution and you figure out what thing needs to do what. And what do I have to do to make sure there's a backup plan in the eventuality of some kind of failure or some condition that's created that necessitates this backup plan? And that is a very important step that I think as an industry we can do a lot more of. And there are people that actually help you with this. You can really get somebody in to come and look at your individual assessment and say, here's an area that you might want to think about or consider as an improvement area. You might want to consider putting an HID reader here instead and switch off the proc stuff and get away from Magstripe and get away from Wigand. These are all things that you consider and you work through it, and then there's obviously a cost associated in some cases. You weigh up that cost versus what could happen if I don't. So it's all about just assessing your own risk and then figuring out where can I best use my technology.
Build your plan, execute your plan. That's what it sounds like. Very, very helpful. Good first step. Steve, same question. What can our listeners do better?
Okay, I'm going to do the typical redirect thing.
Go for it.
I always love it when someone's being interviewed and they just walk right around the question.
Politician.
Yeah, and I will never be one of those. But I think I want to point something out here. And I was listening to Johan with such a great comment there. And I'm going to take an opportunity before we run out of time to talk about a little bit about what we do with what he just talked about. So in HID, especially in the areas that he and I work in, what he talked about there, threat modeling. Threat modeling, I can tell you, is an area of extreme focus for us. We have an entire process and a documented methodology and a documented model that gets created for every product that we sell that goes through and does exactly what he's talking about for every aspect of how something is used. Looked at from every angle, every direction, and we define every possible scenario that we can ever come up with that someone could potentially try to leverage something outside of the way it's intended to be used. And then we turn around and document how that could potentially work, and then what we have done in the design to ensure that it can't be done. And that is how we spend an enormous amount of our time. I can tell you that I've been around technology development for a long time, and I've never seen a company that puts the focus on this like this place. And I will tell you that you should, if you've ever had a question about it, you should feel a lot of comfort knowing that the enormous amount of effort that goes into that within HID is really happening. So I just wanted to highlight that. I know I didn't really answer your question, but you asked him what customers could do. Well, I want the customers to know, or the users to know, what we're doing to help them with that.
And as we always say, it takes a lot of people to secure a lot of people. So very, very helpful. All right. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our podcast today. So Johan, Steve, thank you both very, very much for sharing your expertise and perspective. And like I said, we may have an episode in season 6 or 7 that we can come back to. So looking forward to having y'all back.
Great.
Well, As always, it's been a true pleasure having our guests, and an even greater pleasure and a bigger thanks to our listeners for joining us for this episode. We really do love creating this podcast. It's a lot of fun, and we hope you equally enjoy having fun and you learn something along the way. Now, of course, we'll be back next week with yet another burning question on another hot industry topic. Speaking of which, to be the first to know when new episodes are published, please be sure to subscribe to HID Connects. Doing so will ensure that you stay connected to us. You can subscribe, of course, wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, be sure to rate and review the podcast. And if you're only listening, you're missing out on half the fun. You can also watch us on YouTube, and be sure to check us out on our social channels. Now, this is called HID Connects after all, so in the spirit of connection, please send me your questions, your topic ideas for future episodes. All you have to do is drop me a line at media@hidglobal.com. So until next time, thanks as always for listening. May your identities forever be secure.